Thank you, everyone, for being here. Ryan's thesis is to be commended for choosing as its organizing themes topics that, given his passion for them and their own intrinsic interest, he would be happy pursuing the rest of his life. And these are depth psychology, the power of depth psychology, and the mythical imagination to reveal to us the dangers, complexities, and poetic charge of human experience. This thesis may seem radical, off-putting, and weird. This whole mode of interpretation, and in a sense it is. But as I listened to his eager and voluble discourse in the course of this semester, I found the ways in which it actually illuminated so many of the interior dynamics of the poem, tantalizing, seductive, and I came this close to eating the but I will
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for your introduction. I would also like to thank you for being such a great guide and helper in my thesis and also my oration. I would like to thank my two other panelists, Dr. Zimmer and Dr. Al, for being here. I would like to begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We have always been afraid of the dark. Since man's first beginnings, we have strived to dispel this darkness. And I'm speaking particularly of the darkness of the mind. Myth is one of man's first attempts at understanding the world around him, his own mind, and the workings of the gods. Myth is a story from history and generally recounts images of people's origin, explanation of the cosmos and the psyche, and involves supernatural beings or events. Carl Jung, a practicing psychiatrist for over 20 years, author of over 30 psychological works, and one of the founders of analytical psychology, was greatly interested in the implications that myth had on the mode in which mankind thought. He said of this mode, thinking in primordial images and symbols which are older than the historical man, which are inborn in him from the earliest times, and eternally living, outlasting all generations, still make up psyche. It is only possible to live the fullest life when we are in harmony with these symbols. So Jung was possessed of the idea that myth was not something that is outdated, not something that was merely a part of the evolution of man's literature or understanding, but that the language of myth was very applicable to his field of psychology, going to the extent of even using his knowledge of myth to interpret dreams and delusions of his patients, with great accuracy. Through my own contact with myth and our curriculum, I began to look more closely at these uniting features, bringing us to today. In this oration, I will briefly explain what Jung came to believe, how he mapped the structure of the mind, and then through the broad overview of this, look at Milton's Paradise Lost, and in particular, the characters of Adam and Eve. And I will demonstrate how myth is applicable with psychology. So Carl Jung was possessed of the idea that man's mind was linked by a single consciousness that sat under the perception of any individual. These primordial images and symbolisms that he speaks of is the language of this underlying consciousness. Jung used mythology in understanding the mind, for he believed it to display more accurately the fact that man's mind is still largely a mystery to us. He said, of speaking in mythological terms, it is possible to describe this content, the mind's, in rational scientific language, but in this way one entirely fails to express its living character. Therefore, in describing the living process of the psyche, I deliberately and consciously gave preference to a dramatic mythological way of thinking and speaking, because this not only more express, but also more exact than scientific terminology, which is wont to toy with the notion that as theoretic formulations may one fine day be resolved into algebraic equations. Jung understood this importance of not taking the mind as something that could be broken down into basic understandings. He knew that there were dark regions in our mind that needed to be described in such a manner that was appropriate to them. So before we continue, I will give a brief overview of how Jung structured his concept of what the human mind was made of in order that we can move on to Milton and use this mapping on the poem. So Jung broke the mind into three parts, primarily. First, he broke it into consciousness, and our consciousness is that area that is active at our beck and call on a daily basis. We have thoughts, dreams, daydreams that take place in this area. We use our consciousness to order the world around us, and this is the primary purpose of our consciousness. We take input from the outside world and from our inside world and order it to structure what we call reality. Now, since the consciousness is so pivoted towards order, when the crisis or chaos arrive, it can be a shattering thing. For example, if we have an impression that someone is our friend and we trust them dearly and they break that trust, maybe they steal something, maybe they lie to us, we then bring into question the fact that, well, perhaps my structure of reality isn't what I thought it was. Reality as I have now received it does not line up with my perception of it. And so that forces the mind to reevaluate. We have to make the decision, well, perhaps they didn't actually mean to do that. They are still my friend. Or we have to restructure it and say, no, I was wrong. Reality is not what I thought it was. They are not my friend. So basically, our consciousness is geared towards ordering and structuring the world around us to make it intelligible. The next layer, or the subliminal layer of the mind, is the personal subconscious. This area is particular to every one of us, as it is made up of the parts of the mind that we have either forgotten or suppressed. Perhaps memories of our childhood live here, perhaps things we are afraid of, perhaps opinions or hopes and desires. But those that live there, we cannot recollect with great ease into our conscious mind. They play a role on our conscious mind behind the screen of perception. As the unconscious part of the mind is autonomous in some ways from our consciousness, it can be a great source of chaos for us. Perhaps feelings or desires or beliefs rise up from it into our conscious mind unsummoned, and this can shatter our outlook on reality or even just our emotional state. So even though it has an order in and of itself, that order is separate and autonomous from that of the consciousness. This brings us to the universal subconscious that we spoke of earlier. Jung defines this as the collective unconscious, so far as we can say anything about it at all, appears to consist of mythological motifs or primitive for which reason the myths of all nations are its real exponents. In fact, the whole of mythology can be taken as a sort of projection of the collective unconscious. Just as the constellations were projected into the heavens, similar figures were projected into legends and fairy tales or upon historical persons. So Jung used his theory of the collective or the universal subconscious to link it to myth. Myth is the language of the universal subconscious. We cannot fully understand what it is without speaking of it in these terms. That is why Jung said in his writing on critical analysis of psychology that if I try to speak about it in analytical terms, I will simply fail to convey what I am talking about. In a way, Jung used myth as a burnished shield to approach the Gorgon with and see shadowy images of it. Perhaps not the thing itself, but get closer than anyone has in his field. So now that we have looked at the parts of the mind and how Jung related myth to psychology in general, we will look specifically at the poem Paradise Lost, or the retelling of one of the first Genesis stories. This particular myth struck me as beautifully paralleling the journey of a mind to consciousness, or specifically to mature consciousness. When I say we possess a consciousness, it is an area of our mind. When I say mature consciousness, it is the goal that a mind tries to reach in order to intelligibly translate the world and understand it. Just as a child grows into a man, so does our consciousness grow into maturity. And in this journey, we need a traveler. And this traveler is a single mind that I will take to be represented by Adam and Eve, components of a mind as unconscious and consciousness. Eve as the unconscious and Adam as the consciousness. Very often in myth, the unconscious is presented as pure chaos and the conscious mind as order. I am not claiming that Adam and Eve are pure order and chaos, but that because of their separate autonomy to one another, there are times where chaos can arise from this relationship out of a misunderstanding of the workings of each other's minds. So Adam, we'll start with Adam because he is conscious, and he is also created first, so it seems appropriate. Adam is created by God, or divine order, and placed in a garden, specifically paradise, which means walled garden. So we have already an extension of the greatest consciousness, or God, creating order as an extension in man, and then placing him in an ordered environment. He gives him the one rule, not to go near the fruit of good and evil, and the task of caring for the garden and naming the creatures. Now, this seems like a rather strange first step for Adam. Why name the creatures? What is the significance of having to name the creatures? Why does not God simply tell him? Well, Adam, in his inklings or twilight area of his consciousness, where he's just coming into being, is given the ability to not only understand his terms, but make the terms. The terms defined and understand what they mean. But if you have the ability to make your terms, you also have the ability in some way to shape reality to what you need it to be. So Adam proceeds to name the animals. After he has gone through all of the animals, he realizes that he has no companion. There is none like him. So he goes to his creator and asks for a companion, specifically one that possesses rationality, and, as he says, collateral love. Why this collateral love? Why this otherness from Adam? Even though Adam is in a prelapsarian state, he is still displayed to us as understanding the fact that he needs to grow, that he needs to develop. And so he asks for someone that is different from him in order to continue his growth. Which brings us to the introduction of Eve, the unconscious, created from the same matter that Adam is created, taken from him and given back to him. This can be symbolically representative of a mind's unconscious to its consciousness. Although Eve appears physically to be separate, as our unconscious may appear to be autonomous from our conscious mind, they do belong to the same mind. So with the introduction of Eve, the unconscious, we begin to see the rapid progression to conflict. Why? Because the mind in its beginning stages needs to find out not only what the exterior world is, but what goes on in the interior world. Jung says of this first stage, the first stage of consciousness, subsisting in merely recognizing or knowing, is an anarchic or chaotic state. But why chaos or why conflict? As I pointed out, the autonomy of the consciousness from the unconscious mind has two structures of order. Even though the unconscious mind may have a structure, it is shadowy and unintelligible to the consciousness, which it is naturally mistrustful or apprehensive of. Adam recognizes this feature very quickly in Eve. He recognizes that Eve has some kind of influence on him that is not exactly in the structure of order or reason, but something that is subtler, something that is more seductive. He says of this, "Yet when I approach her, her loveliness so absolute she seems, and in herself complete so well to know, her own, that what she wills to do or say seems wisest, virtuous, discreetest, best. All higher knowledge in her presence falls, degraded. Wisdom in discourse with her loses discountenance, and like folly shows authority and reason on her weight." This control outside the bounds of Adam's reasons challenges his understanding and makes him slightly apprehensive of this interaction. Just as when perhaps you fall in love, or you see something that frightens you, and a feeling or an emotion rises up without any summoning and is presented to your consciousness is naturally taken aback. It is challenged by this. It has to decide whether it is something that it will accept into its reality or suppress back into the unconscious. Two examples of this inability to understand the relationship of the mind for Adam are the night and Eve's dream. The first example, the night, or Eve's questioning specifically of the night, comes when Adam and Eve go to retire in the afternoon. And Eve inquires why they retire at dusk instead of enjoying the night. She draws the beautiful imagery of the fact that the moonlight and the starlight draw an almost alternative reality on the landscape that they are so familiar with during the day. And she asks Adam why they do not enjoy this. Adam's answer very much appears as sort of a half answer or a sidestepping of this issue. He doesn't really give a very good explanation. He simply says we must work during the day and sleep during the night, and the angels will enjoy the stars. Although this is an answer, it really doesn't satisfy Eve's curiosity. Although she curiously says no more, accepts the will of Adam, and they retire. And now secondly, we come to the dream. Upon waking up, Eve retells her dream to Adam, the consciousness, in the waking hours. Eve tells that she dreamt of falling asleep and then being woken up in the night by a voice that sounded like Adam's. From there, she was led to the forbidden tree, encountering a beautiful angel who praises knowledge and says that none can be forbidden. Taking the fruit, extending it to Adam, it is implied that Eve eats of the fruit, but is not explicitly said. She finds herself soaring above the garden or paradise, or specifically above the construct of human order. Or, in other words, she has a godlike view for a few moments. Then sinking down, she is awakened by Adam. Adam is perturbed at the retelling of this dream and is very disturbed by the fact that the dream involves the trespassing of the one commandment that they were explicitly told not to. He shakes it off as being built by false fancy, having nothing to do with Eve's actual mind, and that she is not culpable for anything, and that they must ignore this. Now, Jung would strongly disagree with Adam's analysis of this sort of dismissive wave of the hand of the dream. Jung looks at dreams as images and thought associations which we do not create with conscious intent, spontaneously, without our assistance, and are representative of psychic activity withdrawn from our arbitrary will. Therefore, the dream is, properly speaking, a highly objective, natural product of the psyche, from which we might expect indications or at least hints about certain basic trends in the psychic process. So Jung is claiming that dreams, products of the unconscious and brought into our minds during sleep, are sort of prophetic utterances of dreams, desires, fears, and thoughts that our conscious mind will not accept. Perhaps it is a deed that we would say to ourselves in our waking hours, I would never do that, I would never think that. But really deep down, there is a slight desire for that. And so, from a psychological point of view, Eve's dream is a prophetic utterance of the fact that in some ways, the mind does really desire the knowledge of the tree. Bringing us to the final steps in this drama. Jung says of the fall, the biblical fall of man presents the dawn of consciousness as a curse. And as a matter of fact, it is in this light that we first look upon every problem that forces us to greater consciousness and separates us even further the paradise of unconscious childhood. Every one of us would gladly turn away from his problems. If possible, they must not be mentioned, or better still, their existence is denied. When a mind perpetually sidesteps the incorporation of the subconscious into the conscious mind, chaos inevitably builds into a shattering wave. And this is what we see take place in the fall. The first moments after Eve's fall, Adam is filled with confusion, unsure if he should join his spouse or abandon Eve. Yet he comes to the realization that even though she has fallen, he is still inseparable from her. He says, "My own in thee, for what thou art is mine. Our state cannot be severed. We are one flesh, to lose thee or to lose myself." Adam is now aware of the reality that chaos is not something that is part of the external world alone. He no longer lives inside a sheltered garden. He now is aware of the fact that part of his own mind is chaos. His order and his structure is paralleled by an unquestionable amount of doubt and darkness. Yet, upon eating the apple, Adam, for a moment, rejoices in this new knowledge, in this new epiphany of awakening. He says, "But I feel far otherwise the event, not death, but life, augmented, opened eyes, new hopes, new joys, taste so divine that what of sweet before hath touched my sense, flat seems to this and harsh." Adam's first encounter with the huge horizon that the world presents to him now, outside the construct of just his pure order, is a beautiful thing for a moment. And then he is awakened by the fact that he must leave. He can no longer be safe from the serpent. Not the serpent on the tree, but the serpent within him. And this drives them to near despair. Yet we have the intervention of divine order. Divine order symbolically representing the mind that has passed the storm. It has decided what its new order looks like. What is the reconstruction of reality? If my friend has betrayed me, what now is the world to me? So the world is reordered, and a higher level of consciousness is reached for Adam and Eve. Now, all of this is not to say that I believe that man could have only gained consciousness through the eating of the forbidden fruit. But symbolically speaking, to us as fallen man, and from a psychological point of view, a maturity in consciousness dictates an unavoidable confrontation with chaos. In closing, we have looked at the link between myth and psychology, specifically that being the language of the universal unconscious or the collective unconscious. We then began to understand the basic structure of mind as Jung presents it in his works. From there, we can enter into a specific myth, mapping out from Jung's mind the structure of Adam and Eve as a single mind, consciousness and unconsciousness. Lastly, I would like to the importance of considering myth as much more than simply a concept bearing on our lives. Myth is not simply something that we shelve for. Even though our world has advanced scientifically in a vast amount of fields, and the world in some ways has become slightly disenchanted, we obviously no longer look for trolls on mountaintops or dragons in caves. Myth is a standing reminder that these battlefields and these areas of exploration remain within our minds to be sought out and understood. Practically speaking, that means understanding that inclinations that we may originally want to suppress or initially feel uneasy about perhaps should be investigated or explored and attempted to be understood. Running from these is a sign that we are attempting to climb back over the garden wall. God makes it very emphatically clear that this is not an option for us due to the fire-wielding angel at the entrance of the garden. So if we are to be trapped in the world of chaos, myth in some way helps paint a roadmap for us. It helps us understand the workings of our mythological minds to a sense that analytical psychology in a Freudian sense would not do. And so what it comes down to is understanding that myth is painted in our minds as individuals before it makes its way into books and to history. Thank you.
Oh, I would love to hear, yeah. This is a fascinating question, and I think a lot about Genesis. So thank you for unpacking the psychological reading of the text, not only Genesis, but also through Paradise Lost. So my questions come out from that reading. So how does the nakedness and unashamedness fit into the psychological reading of Adam and Eve with Jung? I didn't hear you mention that. I'm interested to see if it fits in either through something Jung said or through something you would generate on your own.
So if I understand your question, it is in a prelapsarian state, why nakedness and unashamed?
Well, yeah, because there's this, they're naked and unashamed. There's a comfort between, there's a total comfort and vulnerability between these consciousness and the personal unconsciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do the psychological reading, that seems like what you have to say. So what I heard you saying, though, is that even pre-fall, right, quote number
There's
5,
conflict, yeah.
there's conflict. I'm just wondering, is there a way you think Jung would try to understand how we could say that this personal subconscious, personal unconscious, and the consciousness were at one time naked and unashamed?
I don't think he directly addresses that at any point, but I think if I was to try to do an answer from Jung, I would say if we're viewing the story from the conscious point of view, because we're reading it from that, in some ways the unconscious is sort of disarmed by consciousness. I couldn't bring out as many examples as I could in such a short time, but there's always this construct of what Adam thinks of Eve and sort of what Eve acts out. And there is a slight incongruity there in some ways. And so I think sort of the vulnerability from a psychological point of view could be looked at in some ways as a denial on the part of the consciousness to accept the fact that the unconscious is in a way a threat to its order. Does that?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. What if, and it might be right, what if, you mentioned that that the life of the human, according to Jung, is about coming to mature consciousness. Right? What if the initial experience of discovering that you have a personal unconscious is without conflict, and you just say, wow, I could just roll with the unconscious, and there's nothing, so less of a denial of its threateningness than the fact that you just don't even know it's possibly a threat because you have this infancy of your consciousness. What do you think of that?
Your question exactly. Are you saying what would happen if you never had this encounter of threat?
Yeah, I'm just proposing another answer to my own question.
The consciousness being sort of aware of the otherness of the things that are given to it from the unconscious, but sort of just enchanted by the magical otherness and
Yeah,
ability of re-seeing the world and so.
meaning the consciousness has a flexibility in its established order to allow the unconscious to influence that in a malleable way rather than sort of fracturing it. And I think if you were to try to argue what would happen psychologically if the fall didn't take place from a Jungian perspective, perhaps it would be something like Adam actually doesn't ignore Eve's questions of the night. He listens to them. He tries to understand them. He says, well, maybe, we do investigate this. Perhaps when Eve has her dream, Adam comes to the realization that, well, maybe we're not as temptation proof as we thought. Maybe we need to examine that. And so that in that situation, chaos wouldn't be building, it would be accepted sort of one block at a time. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does, yeah. Okay, I could probably spend the whole half hour, and that's just one more question. maybe. So then in the Jungian reading of Genesis, is there no real moral transformation that takes place? Is it really even appropriate to call it fall? Aren't we actually falling up? What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I knew as a theologian you would bring that up. I thought about it for a very long time and thought like, well, what does that mean for us? So Jung never claimed to be religious. He said if he was to believe in God, you'd really have to show it to him. So at least from his perspective, the fall is not a curse. It is a good thing. And it is pretty fascinating to think of it that way, in as much as the psychological connotations of it for us, because of the fact that we are where we are, like in an evolution, it makes sense to look at it as a blessing. But I don't know if explicitly sort of a psychological viewpoint of it has to discount the moral one. I think in some ways that the psychological outlook on it could in some ways sort of support and help understand that. I think obviously looking at our minds that are now broken in so many different ways from the conflict that arises in our minds, there are many mental illnesses that come simply from the conflict of the mind. And so it would be hard pressed to say it's a good thing if even just those issues were not present in a way that the fall caused.
So nonetheless, we would call those more like ontological evils than moral ones, right?
Yeah.
So that idea of transgression having been the root of this all seems to fade into the background, I guess. Potentially, if you're really leaning into the psychological reading, I suppose. But anyway, I will not monopolize any more time.
Sure. Thank you, Ryan. Okay, so from Jung's perspective, is the consciousness fearful of the unconsciousness because of the chaos, or is there desire to learn the unconscious or the universal subconscious even?
Honestly, the quote that I used of Adam speaking of Eve, I think it specifically because it's sort of a very interesting example of Adam being very attracted to Eve, but at the same time sort of authority and reason wait on her. So I'm not really sure what to do with her, right? She sort of defeats my reason, but I'm also attracted to her. So Jung would say that there is a draw to the unconsciousness, but also there is a fear of it because of the fact that it doesn't threaten its construct of order. And that's why people, in some ways, get nervous before they do something that they haven't experienced, right? They have this concept of what it should be, but at the same time, they're apprehensive about the fact that reality isn't going to be what they think it is.
But there's a huge desire in the fact that when he was naming all the animals, he realized, like, I want this other thing. Like, my life isn't whole until I get that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a paradox of being drawn towards development, but at the same time, when it actually comes to specific moments, there's a sort of drawing back. Just like we all want virtue, but in that one moment where our virtue is being asked of us, we might, not today. So I think there is a draw towards understanding oneself and a draw towards understanding the unconscious. But at the same time, I think there are particular instances where it can be too frightening or too intimidating.
Okay. Clarify the myth. So does myth help us when psychologically when we see myth, like are we drawn to it, or we're trying to assimilate to it, or kind of like move towards that myth? In other words, you know what I'm saying?
I think it's an active mapping, or at least as you'll see it, it's an active mapping. So it's not something that we see and try to move towards, and it's also an active mapping or a retelling. So, for example, we could literally go for half an hour straight and just list fairy tales that have dragon fights in them. And that, right, is an image of maybe conquering something within the subconscious that is a great threat to consciousness, or perhaps something exterior. So Jung would look at myth specifically as a fear or desire about something that has a hard time actually formulating. Just like it's really hard to define, you can't define the universal unconscious like in very scientific terms. But at the same time, it sort of speaks the language of myth and helps you understand, like, oh, I'm apprehensive about, I don't have a name for this, let's call it a dragon, or something like that in the mind of Milligan. So,
yeah, so with that, I'm curious, when it comes to marriage, like where are the parallels of like Adam and Eve and marriage? Or like oh, I'm desiring to marry this woman.
Uh-huh.
And where are the
parallels? So your question is, what is marriage and myth, or?
No, well, the Adam and Eve,
okay.
And so from Jung's perspective, where does that come into play when it comes to marriage? Like, is the myth of Adam and Eve, like, how does it parallel our psychological like approach to marriage?
That's a really long answer. I'm gonna try to see if I can simplify it. There's a lot of different sort of levels you can look at that. Perhaps the fact, right, in some ways it illustrates the fact that the mind cannot be separated, right? Even if consciousness causes a lot of conflict, you can't separate yourself from it. Otherwise you'll develop split personality disorder or something like that, right? So you have this illustration of, well, you're sticking it out, Adam and Eve, you've got to figure this out. You can't just, mess up and then start over again, as that is maybe one of their options at that point. So I don't know if I could speak distinctly to what is the mythological connotations of Adam and Eve's marriage to actual marriage. But I think the fact that they are married to one another represents a relationship that is one that cannot be separated, that needs to be sorted out, rather than one that can be abandoned, right? They can leave the garden, they can eat the fruit, they cannot eat the fruit, but they cannot separate from each other. So it's sort of not really a direct answer, because I don't know if I could, within the scope of this, really talk about, he has a whole like half book on marriage as a psychological relationship.
Lastly, real quick, in the secular world, if we don't have Adam and Eve, I'm raised in a family where like, Adam and Eve don't exist, the Bible is not real, so on and so forth. What are the myths that our like youth have in today's world, in the secular world, that are like supporting or drawing them towards marriage?
Well, we really crushed it. At least in our secular culture, we've really abandoned myth. Meaning what kids consume normally, I wouldn't really consider any, like some of the old Disney movies can be looked at as mythological, like Sleeping Beauty, for example, right? You have the prince who is threatened to be, I'm trying to remember this from like 8 years old. You have the prince who's like separated from his princess, right? And he's got to fight the dragon to get to her, and like the whole point of it is to separate them, right? So you have this like romantic drama of trying to reach that union, but like at least as far as like secular culture goes, we've sort of entirely eliminated the myth for like SpongeBob. Or it's true.
Something you need to reflect on for decades.
answer to this question?
Yeah.
What if the whole Marvel universe of films is contemporary mythology, right? Because if it's about trying to articulate the unarticulatable, the ineffable fears that we have, right? The original Avengers is kind of like the fear from out there in the universe is going to come and attack us through some wormhole, and we're all going to have to, I don't know what we're going to do. We're going to get over it somehow. And then, Age of Ultron, like, is about the fear of technology destroying us, right? And then what about Ant-Man and the quasi-use? What is it? Thank you, quantum.
What you're really afraid of is stuff that's so small that it's actually huge.
Yeah.
Right? Like the quantum universe. Like, have we really abandoned mythology, or have we just pushed it into different media?
I would say we have sort of butchered mythology and then put it in a different media.
Okay.
Because, well, this is why I say butchered, because if you look at the Marvel movies or other movies, they are so structured and there's little agendas that are very intentionally put in there. It's not inspired by what Jung would call the collective unconscious.
Okay.
It's very well thought out to make people think in a very particular manner. And I'm not being a conspiracy theorist here. Like some movies, in order to produce them, they come to value and produced, and the producer is, well, you have to put these 3 agendas in your movie, and then we'll do it.
Okay.
And so there's it's very clear that we agree to sort of take myth and then warp it in a way that is not as developmental as perhaps ancient myth.
You don't have a great poet to remember for.
Yeah.
I wanted you to say a little more about, towards the end of your account of Adam and Eve, you talked about the intervention of divine order as a necessary means, a necessary part of the kind of walled, self-protective order of Adam that has been broken open by Eve's transgression and sort of has unleashed chaos in the mind and the kind of higher reality, which we're falling upward, as Ken put it, is only actually gained by the mind
When divine intervention.
through this divine intervention. Can you?
Yeah. No, I was thinking a lot about that because Jung doesn't really talk about that. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And I think in a way it's Jung sidestepping the reality of the fact that in some ways having divine order there does very much aid one in possessing a higher order of the mind. Mental health is at a place where it's astonishingly worse than it's been before, right? We've sort of, by the elimination of divine order, by having something other than us that we can recourse and help order ourselves, we're sort of definitely destroyed in some ways ties to a sanity that we are losing largely. So I think if Jung really did think about it, he would understand, or he would probably say something about the fact that the divine order allows us to sort of pull ourselves back from that obliterating chaos and reestablish order. We have that hand up in that instance, because if divine order or divine intervention hadn't taken place, at least in Paradise Lost, there's a large likelihood that Adam and Eve would have killed themselves as one of their proposed solutions for falling.
And does that suggest a certain pattern for pursuing depth psychology or Jungian analysis or mythical thinking that is fully mythical and fully psychologically engaged, but nevertheless perhaps more successful because under a Christian horizon?
Yeah, I think at least under a Christian horizon, it allows you to be a little bit more, to pretty much avoid the opinion that you are entirely autonomous from the world around you and you make you who you are, if you will. That's a lot of use in a sentence, but Jung said, not many people, this is not word for word, but he said, not many people have reached this level of self-consciousness. And those who have generally prepay it forward with something like neurosis or far worse. He recognizes the fact that in a secular world, trying to understand yourself will probably drive you in some sense a little mad. which seems a little counter.
The quest for self-knowledge or for knowledge that evil
Yeah.
could destroy you.
Yes, and it says it's actually more common, right? You become a little bit more neurotic when you are constantly trying to figure out what your mind's doing, right? The unconscious exists in order to protect your unconscious in a way where if you had everything in your mind before your consciousness all the time, you would hardly be able to breathe because of that amount of information in front of you. So even though the consciousness sort of worries us, it very much protects us. And so if you try to delve into that without any recourse to aid, then there is a large chance that could injure you. Does that answer your question? Moira?
Thank you so much, Brad. That's beautiful. I wanted you to talk about chaos a little bit more, because you talked about this encounter with reality in your example was the friend who appears to be betraying you or something like that.
Yeah.
But then you also talked about this chaos that dwells in the conscious, which threatens the order of the conscious, which is this contrary reality.
Mhm.
So are you saying that chaos? Like, what exactly is chaos? Is it a subjective, is it subjective to a certain extent, right? Like, my chaos is what shatters my reality? Or is it this larger thing that we all encounter in different ways? You see what I'm saying?
Yes, both. Yes, there are things that it's very rarely not to be chaotic, and then there are things that are subjective chaos. So if you have a fear of purple napkins and somebody else doesn't, right, and you enter a room that's got purple napkins in it, you're going to enter into chaos, where for any other normal person, that's going to be a very strange reaction on your part. And I use the absurd example as to point out there are things that are very particular. Maybe something that you were habituated in your childhood that you were afraid of. And then there are things that are universally chaotic. If you have a lion running at you, there are very few human beings that are not going to associate that situation with chaos.
Can I follow up on that with something more specific? Is there, because you mentioned something about this union, the fact that there is one mind, the subconscious and the conscious. And when I'm saying like universal chaos, I'm saying is there reality that as fallen man perhaps we must encounter, like a chaos that
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Where is our individual apples? Are they all the same tree, if you will?
It was a really big apple.
Yeah, no, well, in as much as to say, yes, that universal chaos is chaos. Does that make sense? So whatever tips that in you is chaos. Maybe that particular chaos wears a different mask than something else. Maybe it's a serpent, not a dragon, or a lion, or whatever. So chaos itself, even though it wears many masks, does the same thing in many ways to the mind. So yes and no. Does that make sense? If you're out there looking for the one thing that makes people, go over the edge, you're not going to find it. In as much as it's like that's why myth is myth, because we can't understand that subliminal chaos. It has to put on a shape or a mask, just like Satan has to disguise itself as a serpent or an angel, right? It has to be a shape in order for us to see it. And chaos cannot be perceived as just nothing. Next question.
So I'm trying to understand this a little bit more in terms of Milton as a person.
Mhm.
And according to my understanding, it could be wrong. Milton was a Puritan. And it seems like the underlying premise of Puritanism is that the soul's personal interaction with God, the soul alone, that's the ultimate authority. And I think in that premise, there's a rejection of any sort of external order or external hierarchy like the church. It's just about the soul and God and that personal conflict. And I'm wondering if you have any comment as to how that kind of Puritanistic background of Milton affects his psychology or even taints it.
Yeah, I chose Milton instead of the Genesis story, one, because I was kind of trying to interpret the actual Bible. And sort of by accident, I realized in some ways it really utilized what I was trying to do. In some ways, it made it more accessible to me. I'm definitely nowhere near anything like a professional psychiatrist or whatever. So it made it a little bit more accessible because of the fact that it was a very simplistic relationship between the soul and God, and there wasn't a bunch of other subliminal messages maybe that I could have sort of gone rampant with. So I guess that would be my comment on that.
Yeah, if I could follow up, do you think that this kind of interaction between order and chaos within our soul, or the consciousness and the unconsciousness, is that purely a personal individual experience, or is that something that can be kind of a part of a community? So it's not just my own consciousness, my own order within me conflicting with my chaos and my unconsciousness, but I can actually draw on the orderings of other people and of authorities like the church, things that I think you talked a little bit about after the fall. There's this kind of imposition of divine order, which
Yes.
seems to be something external. But do you think that like external orderings can actually play a part in our internal interaction between those two elements of our soul?
Yeah, very, very much so. That's what a psychologist does when he's giving his patient a therapy, right? He's not going to come up to his patient, right, trigger whatever mental illness he has, and then just sort of walk off, right? He's going to help him do that and help him like reconstruct his order. But that patient probably wouldn't be able to do that on his own, right? So he is ill enough that he needs that order. But then, right, take our institution here, right? You probably go through more crises than someone who is taking a degree in business, right? Because you are entering the world you're entering the world of chaos quite often. And so that's helping you, right, expand your mind. But if you didn't have a professor to run to and like help fish that out, and other people around you to help, combat that chaos, you're just sort of be left in either a decision of, well, the world is crisis and I don't know what to do with it, or you just suppress it. So exterior order is almost essential, to maintaining that order. Veronica.
Thank you, Ryan. So you were just speaking about like external solutions to the chaos that we feel within ourselves. And kind of related to that, are there any sort of internal solutions that we can kind of go to when we have this chaos between our unconsciousness and our consciousness, or do we always have to go to an external source?
Yes, this is just like an answer from the paper. I'm not like giving you advice to sort out the chaos of your life. Clean your room. I would say, face it. Don't run from it. I guess that's what really my message is. If you just ignore that dragon, it's just going to grow older and bigger in your unconscious. So if there's something that really bothers you, internally take stock. What is making me anxious today? Is it the fact that I haven't done that assignment that I should have done yesterday? Is it, the list can go on, right? So it's taking stock and it's facing those things that make us uncomfortable. It's sort of gripping the arms of your chair and looking it in the face versus trying to avoid it or suppress it. So that's the internal solution, if you will, very, very basically.